Okay, great. So I am really happy to be introducing Professor Randall D. Beer. Professor Beer is a professor of cognitive science and informatics at Indiana University. He directs the NSF/IGA training program in the dynamics of brain-body environment interaction in behavior and cognition. He also teaches quantum computing, dynamical systems, and autonomous robotics. Professor Beer's research is broadly concerned with understanding how coordinated behavior arises from the dynamical interaction of animals' nervous system, its body, and its environment. So without further ado, I'm very excited to be learning more about autopoiesis and inaction in the game of life.
All right, thank you, Angie. Let me share my screen. Can everybody see the slides okay?
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, let me get started then. So the majority of my work falls within what is nowadays often called the 4E approach to cognition. And this approach is built on 4 pillars, the 4 E's: embodied, embedded, extended, and enactive. And most of my work is focused on the first 3. I've done quite a bit of work on thinking about behavior and cognition as the result of interactions between brain, body, and environment systems. But what I want to talk about today is the 4th pillar of 4E cognition, namely enaction. And in particular, I want to talk about a research program that's aimed at elucidating the sort of theoretical foundations of the enactive approach. So it's challenging to sort of explain enaction briefly and visually, but I'm going to give it a go. The basic structure of enaction looks something like this, that some organizations of interdependent processes can become autonomous, okay? And those autonomous processes give rise to an identity which distinguishes itself from its surroundings to be treated as a sort of independent entity or unit of interactions. And that identity, in turn, defines a domain of interactions with its environment. And that domain of interactions finally induces a kind of world of significance, as we often say in enaction. What was previously a kind of undifferentiated physical universe, now through the interactions of the identity with its environment, some features of that physical universe have significance, have importance, have meaning to the entity, the identity, whereas others do not. So enaction in a nutshell is all about the co-emergence of an identity and its world of significance through its actions. And in fact, the word enact literally means to bring forth through action. And it dates to the 15th century, where it was used to describe the way performers would bring an artistic performance to life on a stage through their performances, through their actions. And also it was used in the 15th century in a legal context to talk about the way legislators can bring laws into existence through their actions as legislative bodies. So the enactive framework was first sort of put forward under that name in a 1991 book called The Embodied Mind, and it's since proliferated in many different directions. And it's really founded on 2 key ideas, both of which I've already mentioned, the idea of autonomy and the idea of enaction. But what many people don't know is that those ideas themselves actually didn't come out of nowhere. They're basically founded on earlier work by the Chilean biologist Humberto Maturana here on the left and Francisco Varela on the right, where the enactive notion of autonomy is actually a generalization of what they called autopoiesis, and the enactive notion of enaction is actually a generalization of what they called structural coupling. So these 2 concepts of autopoiesis and structural coupling are kind of what I'm going to be focusing on most of today. And we can think of these as a kind of way to try to bridge physics and chemistry on the one hand and biology on the other, in the case of autopoiesis, and biology and cognition in the case of structural coupling. So one of the problems with both enaction and this earlier biology of cognition work that Enaction grew out of is, at least it's a problem from my perspective, is that these very intriguing frameworks have largely only been verbally expressed. Much of the work in Enaction is linguistic in nature. People talk about things. It's more philosophical, it's more verbal. And one of the things that I've always been interested in is how we might more precisely formulate the underlying theoretical structure behind all this language and verbiage. So the way I do this, in this case, this is an example of a more general approach that I take to this kind of research. But in this particular case, my approach has been to try to develop these frameworks, the ideas in the frameworks, in a physical universe, or at least a universe that's much simpler than our universe. Okay, and in particular, I'm going to be trying to talk about all of the concepts of autopoiesis and structural coupling and some of the concepts of enaction derived from them in the context of John Conway's game of life cellular automata. Okay. Now, on its face, that may seem like a really ridiculous thing to do, but I just ask you to bear with me for at least a little bit so I can try to show you how even that simple model universe has a lot to teach us about how to think about some of these concepts. So the basic idea is I treat Conway's game of life cellular automata rules as a kind of physics. So we have a two-dimensional binary universe that consists of a field of components whose dynamics are governed by a single universal law that produces new local arrangements of components from that's local in both time and space, is what I wanted to say, and that exhibits both rich pattern-forming dynamics. Do the movies come through okay over Zoom for people? Good. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So Conway himself actually formulated game of life in a rather different way. He thought of each of these lattice elements as biological cells and thought of them as populations of interacting cells. But this just goes to show that any mathematical model can be subjected to many interpretations. I'm going to interpret it as just a physics. So this is the lowest level ground truth of a particular physical universe that's not our physical universe, but is instead still governed by this universal law. So this physics gives rise to an artificial chemistry, a spatial artificial chemistry, in which sort of local arrangements of primitive physical components trigger reactions, trigger processes, as I'm going to call them, that give rise to new local arrangements of physical components. And so we can also think about this as a field of processes that are continuously coming into existence, running and potentially extinguishing over time. Namely, we can think of this as a chemistry, and we can actually enumerate all the different kinds of processes that can arise in that chemistry. Okay. This chemistry, in turn, gives rise to it supports self-sustaining and self-individuating networks of processes that I'm going to think of in terms of emergent individuals. Okay? So this is a term I will be using repeatedly. Roughly speaking, but I haven't explained why this is true yet. Roughly speaking, we're going to think of these entities, these emergent individuals, as a primitive kind of biology. And these emergent individuals, in turn, interact with their environments and one another in the generation of sequences of sometimes rich and intricate behavior. Okay. So I'm going to try to walk you through this entire sequence, cashing out what at this point are just sort of broad claims about things. And I want to walk you through this sequence using selected results from this research program. I'm going to skip many of the details. But as I was mentioning to Dasan earlier, the talk is kind of modular. So I can go into more detail about something that someone is interested in, or if we get pressed for time, I can just skim over the sort of high-level pieces of some of the modules that I'll be covering. Okay. So before I jump into that, are there any sort of questions about the ground rules here in terms of what it is I'm interested in and what I'm trying to do?
Yes, I would love to hear a little bit more about the bounded system and the biology. and how it gives rise to the behavior.
So we're going to be
network.
talking about that in great detail, starting with the next slide. So if that doesn't deliver, please ask the question again.
Cool.
Okay, so let's start then with this notion of an emergent individual. In particular, I'm going to be talking about what's often called in the enactive literature the constitutive aspects. What is an emergent individual? Why do we call it an emergent individual? How do such things arise? How do we characterize them formally, and so on? Okay, so let's start there. Maturana and Varela's concept that's relevant to emergent individuals was autopoiesis, okay, which I've already mentioned previously. It's what the notion of autonomy and enaction was generalized from. So autopoiesis is a neologism, a term that Maturana and Varela formulated from the Greek roots auto for self and poiesis for creation or production. So it literally means something like self-creation. Okay. So slightly more technically, they defined autopoiesis or an autopoietic system as a network of processes of production of components which satisfy two conditions, a self-production condition and a self-distinction condition. And roughly speaking, self-production involves the fact that these networks of processes continuously regenerate and realize the network that produces them. And self-distinction involves the fact that this network of processes constitutes a system as a distinguishable unity in the domain in which they exist. So pictorially, the idea underlying autopoiesis is something like this. We have some kind of a bounded system whose dynamics generates a network of processes. Those processes produce components that are the very components that make up the bounded system that originally generated this network. Okay, so there's kind of a circular dynamic going on here. This is often talked about in terms of closure, sometimes organizational closure, sometimes operational closure. However, it's important to emphasize that the sense of closure is really a mathematical sense of closure. It doesn't mean it's isolated from its environment. So to support a cycle like this in our physical universe, you would require high quality energy and matter to be constantly pumped into the system, and there would be waste products constantly leaving. Another way of looking at this is if this is an entity, it's constantly receiving sensory input from its environment and taking actions onto its environment. So this closed organization is not a closed system in the sense that it's not isolated from its environment. Okay. So what I want to do is take, again, this largely verbally expressed idea from Maturana and Varela and ask how it might be applied to the localized, persistent entities that we observe in the game of life. So hopefully this will start to answer Angie's question. So the example I'm going to focus on is the one I've spent the most effort with, and that is what's called a glider in the game of life, this little object right here. Okay, it is the simplest motile, that is moving, entity that can arise in the game of life. And if you just randomly initialize game of life universes, these things will appear. Okay, that doesn't require any special work to make that happen. Okay, so this is the entity, the emergent individual that I am going to be focused on and trying to analyze from the context of Maturana and Varela's notion of autopoiesis. Okay. So if you look carefully at this glider, it's characterized by a 4 cycle. It goes through 4 steps, starts in this, say in this form, goes to this configuration, this one, and then comes back to the same form, but offset diagonally 1 cell in the forward, in the left, right, and the up, down direction. And it's just that unfolding cycle of 4 transformations that you're seeing here as the glider walks along through its environment. Okay. So underlying this glider, if we wear our chemistry lens here, are a set of processes that are taking place within the physical universe. And this is just showing that evolving set using the notation that I haven't explained to you because we don't really need to get into those details unless you want to, but each of these is a distinct kind of process, okay? We can combine this picture of the structure of a glider, just us looking into the physics and sort of seeing these recurring patterns of components and this processual description by noting that essentially a configuration of components such as this one produces or generates or triggers a set of processes, and those processes produce new arrangements of components that in turn trigger the next set of processes. And so these two pictures are interlinked in this kind of a cycle. And when you come around once, what happens is the same set of processes get re-triggered as we had the first time around. It's just that they're embedded spatially in a different location in the physical environment. Namely, they're offset by one cell left, right, and one cell up, down. Okay. So let me unpack this a little bit by showing you. Let's focus on just these. Can everybody see my cursor? Yes, good. Okay. Let's focus just on these 9 cells, these 9 components in this particular glider configuration. Okay. That triggers this process in the sense that whenever you put those 9 components together in that pattern, this process will trigger. That's what the chemistry says, which itself is grounded in the Conway physics. Okay. When that process triggers, what it does, and this is what the blue indicates, is it creates a new component, a 1 component, which will constitute this element of the new configuration. Okay. And that 1 component itself will play a role in triggering 9 different processes in the next step. Okay. So we can think of this relationship between components triggering processes, producing components that trigger processes, as defining a set of dependency links between processes. So if we just sort of abstract away from the structural configurations and focus only on the processes, we can say that, for example, the product of this reaction, of this process, plays a role in triggering a bunch of other processes. And we can make that, we can extract those dependency links for all processes in this closed network. Okay. And when we do that, we end up with an interconnected, closed process dependency network that consists of a variety of different kinds of processes whose triggering conditions depend on the products of other processes in the same network. So this is a circular dependency network that's operationally closed. Again, it's not isolated from its environment, but it's closed in the sense of self-production in Maturana and Varela's terms. By the way, I forgot to mention a very common confusion about autopoiesis is it involves self-reproduction, but that is not at all the case. It is self-production. In self-reproduction, an organism makes another copy of itself. In self-production, the organism literally makes itself and remakes itself. The metaphor I like to use that was on that slide was it's like a factory for making things, except it's a very special factory in that the thing that it makes is itself, not something else. Okay. Now, since we have assumed in everything I've done here an empty environment, I explain more about that a little bit later, but since we've assumed an empty environment, I actually call this it's the vacuum glider organization. It's the organization you get if you let a glider just glide around through an empty universe. Okay, that sort of thing is not possible in our universe because everything runs down thermodynamically. You need a constant source of energy and matter to sustain these sorts of circular or closed organizations. In the Conway physics, however, that's not the case. So it is possible to just have an isolated glider persist indefinitely. And that's the glider whose organization we've just extracted. And this process, which I haven't gone through in great detail, but I hope I've given you a sense of where it comes from, this process of extracting an organization like this can be done for any persistent bounded entity in the game of life, not just a glider. And it's straightforwardly adaptable to bounded persistent entities in other cellular automata, and arguably in any discrete time, discrete space, spatial chemistry. Okay. Generalizing this to continuous time, continuous spaces is technically a lot more difficult. And in fact, one of my students has a paper in A-Life next week that looks into some of the issues involved in doing that. Okay. But we're just going to focus on this glider example. Again, a lot of stuff I just threw at you. Maybe it's worth briefly pausing and seeing if there are any clarifying questions about what I just walked you through on this slide before we move forward.
What's the question, Matthias? Yeah, sure. We've got one question.
Sure.
Yeah, so my question is
You'll need to answer here.
yeah, so you said that a thing produces something, but the thing that it produces is itself. So, like, in a way, what defines a thing? Because, like, in a way, doesn't there is a circularity involved. It can't quite exist in its full potential, so to speak, if it needs to produce itself.
I'm sorry, you keep cutting in and out. You mentioned something about a circularity, but
yeah.
I'll go closer to the laptop.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay, so my question is that so that you have a thing, this entity that produces itself, but there's a circularity here, and that if it produces it means that it doesn't quite exist in its full potential if it needs to produce itself. And what defines this thing?
So I mean, it's like all real circularities. It's only an apparent circularity in a sense, right? Because the underlying Conway physics and the underlying chemistry that supports this is itself not circular. What's circular is this network of dependencies of products of processes triggering other processes that have products that trigger other processes that eventually trigger the original process, right? So it's nothing paradoxical here. It's just like, I mean, is an autocatalytic reaction in physical chemistry, in real chemistry, paradoxical. It's circular as well, but it's supported by a non-circular underlying physics and chemistry in the same way that this is. Now, the other half of your question sounded like it might be, where does this come from?
Not quite. So maybe you answered my question. So is it accurate to say that it can be just as well called self-maintenance, self-perpetuation?
I mean, certainly one can use other words to describe it. What I'm trying to do is map it into Maturana and Varela's terminology, because the larger project here is to take their verbally expressed framework, which serves as the basis for enaction, and try to see how it could be cashed out and ideally formalized in at least this toy model universe. That doesn't mean you couldn't also apply other frameworks to this same toy model universe, right?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, let me go on. Just going back to the picture of autopoiesis, this is the way this toy model maps onto that diagram I showed you for autopoiesis. So we have a bounded system, which is the glider. The dynamics of that arrangement of components under the Conway physics and chemistry basically generates a network of processes. And those processes collectively produce components that are the very components that make up the bounded system. So this is just how that maps onto the circularity of autopoiesis. Okay. And again, because of the nature of the Conway physics, we don't require the inflow of matter and energy to support this kind of setup, but we do still, as I will show you, allow external influences to affect this glider. I haven't talked about it yet, but I'll be adding that piece in. And then the glider's actions itself can affect the rest of the universe. So we still have this closed organization, but open to interaction with its surroundings. Okay. So there are a number of different things one can look at with just this basic toy model of an emergent individual. One that I've done some work on, but I didn't plan to go through it today, is one can inquire into the origins. So one can essentially ask the origin of glider question for this universe. Where do gliders come from? How do they arise? Under what conditions do they arise? And so on. And effectively, you can construct a statistical mechanics of gliders that can answer those questions. And that's some work I've done, which I can go into, but I'd like to set it aside unless somebody's really interested in it, in which case we can return to it later. But I want to point out that once you take one of these simple toy models and you take a concept like Maturana and Varela's notion of an emergent individual and you cash it out, you can start to leverage that toy model to ask all kinds of interesting questions and to explore all kinds of interesting angles on it. The one I want to talk about next is interaction. So as I said, these emergent individuals are not isolated from their environment, although we've defined them that way so far, but now we have to recognize that they are in fact subject to interactions with their environment. So let's first consider the effect of an environment on an emergent individual, and then I'll return to talk about the two-way interaction between individuals, emergent individuals and their environments. So to look at this, I'm going to talk about what happens to gliders when they are perturbed by external influences. And let me introduce just a little bit of informal terminology. The glider basically takes two forms, which I'm going to refer to as the wedge and the rocket, okay, just based on their visual appearance. And essentially all 16 configurations that we can observe of a glider when it's embedded in a universe are just going to be rotations, reflections, and handedness, well, rotations and reflections, essentially, of these things, okay? So you can get these 16 configurations just by rotating or reflecting these two primitive forms, okay? Whenever we identify a glider, we come in and say, that thing is a glider. It's an object of interest that I want to investigate scientifically in this universe. We effectively leave behind a glider-shaped hole in the rest of the universe. That is, by distinguishing a glider, we're distinguishing it from something, which is the rest of the universe. And so we have this sort of two-component ontology, if you will, now, the glider and the not glider, okay? And the edges of that glider-shaped hole basically form the glider's immediate environment, which I'm going to call the one environment, since it's at a spatial offset of one from the glider. And essentially, all influences of the environment on the glider have to pass through that one environment, okay? This one environment has 24 cells, so 24 physical locations to it in the Conway physics. So there's 2 to the 24th possible states that one environment can take on, okay? And if we think of those as perturbations to the glider, because anything further away can't immediately affect this glider. There's a speed of light in the Conway physics, just like there is in real physics. Influences can only move one lattice cell per time step. Okay, so anything further away is going to take another time step before it can causally influence the glider. Okay, so we can look at what happens to a glider when it's subjected to all 2 to the 24th possible perturbations that it can receive from its environment. And we'll see that many of those perturbations are destructive in the sense that we had a glider but if you perturb it in certain ways, we no longer have a glider. The physics continues, the chemistry continues, but the emergent individual is gone. Its organization has been violated. It's disintegrated. It no longer exists. There are other networks of process dependencies, but they aren't closed networks of process dependencies like the one that defined the glider. Okay. However, other one environment perturbations are non-destructive. So we can come up, here's just another example of a one environment that is not destructive, and the glider still exists after the perturbation. Okay, but it is changed by that perturbation potentially, which is something that we want to investigate next. Okay. One thing I should mention, I'm glossing over lots of details again. One has to think carefully about what it means for a glider at the next time step to be the same glider. Okay. If you have a glider one time step and a glider at another time step clear across the universe, our intuition is those can't be the same glider. Okay. But if you also don't want to be so strong that you say it has to be exactly the same configuration the next time step as it was in the previous time step. So the definition that I'm using here implicitly is basically the new glider has to fall within the light cone of the previous glider. Okay, so all of its components, all the components of the new glider are within the causal influence cone of the old glider. That's a pretty strong requirement, and there are various ways you could relax that without going to allowing gliders to jump, to teleport across the universe. For example, you could say, as long as some portion of the new glider falls within the causal cone of the old glider, we're going to call it the same glider. But I'm using a stronger condition. The entire new glider has to fall within the causal cone of the old glider to call it the same glider. Okay. All right. Anyway, we have this class of 2 to the 24th one environment perturbations that an environment can impose on a glider, and some of those will be destructive and some of them will be non-destructive. Okay. So it turns out that we can systematically study the effects of all 2 to the 24th perturbations, and most of them are destructive. However, almost 100,000 of them are non-destructive. So if everyone was destructive, then there'd be nothing interesting to say for the rest of this talk. We'd be done. Okay. Every interaction breaks a glider, the end. There are emergent individuals in the game of life for which that's true. But for gliders, it's not true. We have about 100,000 non-destructive perturbations that exist. Surprisingly, that 100,000 non-destructive perturbations fall into one of only 6 classes. Okay. And I've color-coded those classes just to have a way to visually represent them. So there's a class of perturbations that I'm calling brown. So that's a set of one environment configurations that when a wedge glider form is subjected to any of those in that class, it transitions to a rocket glider form with a particular offset, reflection, and rotation. Okay. Likewise, there are black, blue, and orange non-destructive configurations that will not destroy a wedge, but rather transform it in some way. And then there are gray and green sets of environmental configurations that, when applied to a rocket, will preserve that entity, but transform it in some way. And all roughly 100,000 non-destructive perturbations fall into one of these 6 classes. Okay. So this is another detail I'm going to skip, although I'm prepared if one wants to later get into the details of this. We can actually work out the structure of all 6 of these classes of non-destructive perturbations. We can enumerate their members, so we can figure out how many members are in each class from sort of first principles. We can list them if you want to see them all. And we can also explain how the structure of each of these classes is grounded in the glider organization. Okay. But for now, let me just say we can do that. Okay, we can work all that out. And by work it out, I mean in the sense you can write down a set of equations derived from the Conway physics, ultimately, whose solutions give us all members of each of these 6 classes. Okay. All right, so far we've only talked about single perturbations, right? So we have a glider, the environment does something to it, and we're asking what happens next. But of course, for any glider that persists, it's going to be subjected to a sequence of perturbations from its environment. So one perturbation may be a Brown perturbation, which changes this wedge into this rocket, but then that rocket may also get perturbed, say, by a green perturbation, which turns it into a rocket that's flipped top to bottom, and so on, right? So we get these sequences of perturbations, which are branching. Looks like I may have a question. Oh, no. Okay. So we get this tree, or what will turn out to be a graph structure when we look at over time, what is the structure of all possible non-destructive perturbations on a glider? So we can ask, what is that structure? Okay. And it turns out we can map that. It is indeed a graph. What just happened? I think I lost screen sharing. Just a second.
Yeah, we can see you, just not the screen.
Yeah. Give me a second here. Sorry, I hit a button on my keyboard. I'm gesturing even though I'm not in the room with you, just because I can't talk without gesturing. And I hit the wrong key. Give me one moment.
All good.
Still not the right one. Share. Should be. Are we back?
Yes, we are.
Okay, good. So anyway, by doing that experiment, looking at sequences of all possible non-destructive perturbations, we can map out this this graph, which I call the glider interaction graph. And basically, if we zoom into a small piece of it, each of these nodes corresponds to a single configuration of a glider, and each of these arcs correspond to a non-destructive transition. So this rocket undergoes a green perturbation transforming to this rocket, which undergoes a gray perturbation, which transforms to something else, and so on. And it's a graph because it's possible to have sequences of transformations that take you back around to the same original configuration that you started with. Okay. Now, technically, this graph I'm showing you is basically just tracing out all those effects to a spatial offset of 1. Okay. So if we go to a spatial offset of 2, we get a bigger graph in which this graph is embedded. I'm showing it in red. And if we go another step to a spatial offset of 3, we get this graph in which this graph is embedded in red. And basically, the full glider interaction graph essentially would fill the entire game of life universe. So it would be infinite if the universe is infinite, or if the universe is toroidal, if it's got periodic boundary conditions, that eventually this graph would close back up. Okay. So that makes it a little unwieldy to deal with. And it also doesn't really represent the repeating nature of the structure of this graph. So what we can do to bring that structure out is we can basically divide out various symmetries from that graph. So if we divide out the translational symmetries, which basically says from the point of view of a glider, it doesn't matter, except for its immediate 1 environment, it doesn't matter where that's positioned in the universe. It's still going to undergo the same transition when, say, this form is subjected to a blue perturbation. Okay, so if we divide out the translational symmetries, we end up with this finite glider interaction graph representation, which holds even in infinite universes. And in fact, if we want to, we can divide out all the symmetries, which includes the reflection and rotation symmetries, and then the glider interaction graph reduces to something fairly trivial, which just says essentially the only intrinsic degree of freedom that a glider has is it a wedge or a rocket? Okay, if we totally divide out any embedding symmetries, then its intrinsic nature is just it's a wedge or a rocket. And in fact, that highlights the fact that there's actually just two cells. When you flip their states, you transform a wedge into a rocket or a rocket into a wedge. So there really is only one intrinsic degree of freedom. But embeddings are actually going to make an interesting difference. So I'm going to be focusing on this representation of the glider interaction graph. It's finite. It's got the translation symmetries divided out because everything, all the questions we're going to ask about gliders would be the same if you slid the whole universe, any number of cells to the right or left or up and down. It makes no difference to anything I'm going to be saying. Okay. All right, again, let me pause here. Now I've done two things. I've introduced this notion of an emergent individual and argued that there's a way to think about the glider as such an emergent individual that maps onto Maturana and Varela's notions of autopoiesis. And now I've started to look at the interaction that gliders can undergo with their environments by looking at, for now, the one-way perturbations that an environment can impose on a glider and what consequences those effects have. And I've extracted this structure I'm calling the glider interaction graph. So let me pause and see if there are questions about that before we continue to build.
Yes, we have a question.
First, just to clarify, this graph, is that all non-destructive perturbations? Like this is the state, or these are all the states that you can go through either time evolution or non-destructive perturbations?
Yes. Well, in fact, the way I've set this up, an empty environment is included in this set of non-destructive perturbations. So it's not time evolution or perturbation. This covers basically all perturbations, including the null perturbation, where you do nothing to the glider.
Okay, but always in an empty environment.
Well, it's not empty if there's on cells in its one environment, in its immediate neighborhood. So now we're dealing with non-empty environments.
Okay, I was just sort of wondering because, like, I'm imagining the situation where, you know, one glider goes in and interacts with some environment and two gliders come out.
Yes, that can happen.
And if that happens, then, you know, and if it's all within the same light cone of, you know, each individual glider.
You can't fit two gliders into the light cone of the one-step light cone of one glider.
Okay, so it's not possible for two gliders to come in, one to come out, and to have that one that comes out be associated with either of the ones that go in? No,
not under my strict definition. Again, if you use a more permissive definition, like the new gliders only have to overlap the light cone of the earlier glider, then that's possible. But if it has to be entirely contained within the light cone of the previous glider, then two gliders don't fit in one glider's one-step light cone.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, that's a consequence of a decision I've made. One can make a different decision and look at the consequences. I'm not arguing my decision is the only one possible. I'm trying to lay out the decisions I've made and why I've made them.
Yeah, great. I think that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So now we have to complete the other. Now we have to complete the other half of this interaction story. Okay. We've looked at what environments can do to gliders, but the full interaction is a two-way thing. Environments affect gliders and gliders affect their environments. And this is something that Maturana and Varela called structural coupling. And remember, structural coupling was the biology of cognition concept that got generalized into the notion of enaction in the enactive approach. Okay, so now I want to move to the two-way interaction. So if we look at the full existence of a glider, of course, it's going to be actively engaging its environment, right? So here's a sequence where a glider is in some environment. The environment affects the glider affects the environment. Now we have this configuration and so on and so on and so on until eventually this glider is exposed to a destructive interaction that disintegrates it. So the physical environment, the physical universe continues on according to Conway physics, but there's no longer a glider and therefore no longer a glider environment interface and therefore no longer perturbations to a glider to talk about, right? So once gliders disintegrate, our story about them as emergent individuals must come to an end. Okay. But this goes through a sequence of blue, brown, gray, blue, blue perturbations, all non-destructive, before it eventually disintegrates. Okay. So this just goes to show that you can actually get chains of non-destructive perturbations. And these aren't being imposed by me. Rather, the environment around the glider is evolving according to the rules of Conway physics based on its own states and the states of the glider that is contained within it. Okay. So another way to look at this is what we have is this two-way perturbation going on. The glider is affected by its environment, but the glider in turn affects its environment. And these chains of states are a consequence of that two-way interaction. Okay. So what I've done so far is basically pulled this apart, and I've explained to you using the glider interaction graph how the states of the glider depend on themselves and the perturbations from the environment. But clearly, to complete this picture, half the story is missing. I need an environment interaction graph, which says how the states of an environment evolve according to its own states and the perturbations it receives from a glider. Okay. Once I have that, then I can put these two things together and try to explain what happens in this coupled situation. Okay. So let me briefly turn to environment interaction graphs. I'm not going to spend as much time on this. For one thing, they're open-ended, because the bigger the universe is, the bigger the environment interaction graphs that are possible within that universe is. So I'm just going to look at a few minimal examples to give us a flavor of how to think about this. So the smallest square environment, the smallest square universe that can contain a glider is going to be 5 by 5. Okay, since a glider itself is 5 by 5 with some corners missing, and those missing corners constitute pieces of a one environment. Okay, so this is the smallest environment that a glider can interact with. And to make these finite problems, I'm going to again assume that this is on a torus, right? So the top and the bottom and the left and the right are pairwise identified. So this is a periodic space. So if we look at everything that can happen to a glider and its environment, in particular, everything that can happen to the environment part, the glider I'm going to set aside for now, we can put a wedge or a rocket into this space, and the environment can take on one of 8 states. And if we play out all the possibilities that can occur, we end up with this environment interaction graph. So what does this mean? Each of these nodes corresponds to one state of the environment, and each arc corresponds to a transition that that environment state makes. What if it's perturbed by a wedge, it's in red, and if it's perturbed by a rocket, it's in green. So this is the environment interaction graph that a glider generates by interacting with a 5 by 5 environment, which only consists of 3 non-glider cells. But those cells can move around as the glider itself moves. That's why you see so many nodes here. You might have thought you can only see 8 nodes because there's only 8 states possible. But the glider can move around in this 5 by 5 environment. And when it moves, what constitutes its one environment is different. And that corresponds to a different node in this environment dynamics environment interaction graph. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Let me show how this scales up. If we go to a 6x6 environment, we have 14 environment cells, not quite the full one environment, but more of it. And there, the environment interaction graph now has almost 30,000 nodes and almost 18,000 edges, but it consists of about 10,000 disconnected components, which can be grouped into these 6 classes. Okay, and these numbers below each of the class correspond to the distinct configurations that fall into that class, followed by the symmetry equivalent embeddings. Okay, so there are different environment configurations that I can cache out this structure in. That corresponds to the 2. There are 2 different environment states that have the same transition configuration, and the 288 have to do with all the different symmetries that I can produce that would incorporate that structure. Okay, finally, if we go to a 7x7 environment, now there are 27 environment cells. So the full one environment can occur in a 7x7 universe. And there are actually 3 cells from what we could call the 2 environment, the next most close ring of things that can affect the glider in 2 steps into the future. Okay. In this case, we have 213 million nodes, about 135 million edges, and there are the environment interaction graph is disconnected with about 81 million components that can be grouped into 740 classes. And again, I'm just showing you a few of those, some of the more interesting structured environment interaction graphs, which again can have distinct configurations and can have many different symmetry equivalent embeddings. Okay. So in principle, this can be worked out for any size environment, but obviously in practice, there's an explosion going on here. As the environment of the universe gets bigger and bigger, the environment interaction graph gets more and more intricate. Okay. But this is already rich enough for us to go back to our original question of interest, which is how structural coupling works when you put together a glider interaction graph and an environment interaction graph. Okay, so I'm going to show a little illustration of that. The ways in which these 2 graphs can interlock. Now, I could pick a glider interaction graph. There's really only one for gliders, but I could pick a different environment interaction graph that I could embed the glider in different size universes, or in universes that start out in different states and so on. Both of these are just very small pieces of a much, much larger interaction graph. And I've picked a 7x7 universe here. Okay. So this is just a piece of the interaction graph. To actually look at structural coupling, we have to distinguish some start states. So I'm going to put this glider configuration into this environment configuration, which gives me this total setup. Okay. And now this environment triggers a particular transition in this glider state. There are 4 possible kinds of transitions this glider state could undergo, depending upon the class that this falls in. But it turns out this falls in the blue class. So this glider state makes a transition to this glider state. And at the same time, if we put this glider into this environment, then this environment transitions to this environment, which is in fact the only transition it could make, because every other setup here from this case would have destroyed the glider, and therefore this environment interaction graph no longer applies, right? And the total glider environment system undergoes this transition. Okay, and we can just repeat this. So among the possible transitions from this state, this particular environment selects one, and this glider transitions to this one. And likewise, this environment transitions to this environment configuration by virtue of this glider being in this environment. And we get another chain in this sequence of glider perturbations. We go one more, okay. This one is, well, okay, so first of all, this environment perturbed this glider with a gray perturbation, which carries it to this configuration. And this particular glider perturbed this environment into this configuration. And this one's interesting because the environment could have been perturbed into a different configuration if this had been a wedge rather than a rocket. So that's an example of how the glider state can affect the environment. Okay. And if we go one step further, what we find is that although there are perturbations to this glider that would preserve it, none of them fall within the possible next states of this environment. So the glider disintegrates. And what we've constructed is basically a short glider life that began in this state, went through a series of interactions with its environment until eventually disintegrating. Okay. So we can see how a glider life, that is a sequence of non-destructive perturbations, can be carved out of a glider interaction graph and an environment interaction graph through structural coupling. Each step that you go into this, you raise more questions. Now that we see how structural coupling can produce a glider life, we can ask, well, what is the structure of all possible glider lives? What's the set of all lives that a glider can live in a given universe? So in the 5x5 universe, toroidal universe here, it turns out that there are 20 different glider lives, but they're all basically isomorphic. They all consist of immortality. You just keep cycling through that universe forever. Okay. In the 6x6 universe, again, periodic, it's a little richer. There are 24 possible immortal glider lives, each of which have a non-trivial transient. So you go through a sequence of experiences which aren't periodic, but then you eventually fall into a periodic, which just means you keep walking through this periodic 6x6 universe. But there are also quite a number of terminal lives, all of which are extremely short. They basically consist of one interaction, and then anything after that results in disintegration. 7x7 gets even richer. Okay, there are 28 immortal glider lives, which have very intricate transient structures to them. So you can go through a whole, I'm just being silly, fanciful here, but you can go through a whole developmental period, okay, until you fall into your long-term immortal life. There's another kind of immortality where a pair of two gliders can coexist in a 7x7 periodic environment indefinitely. And then there's a bunch of different, very intricate terminal lives where you can go through sometimes very long sequences of experiences, but eventually you die. Okay, eventually you disintegrate. And the trend I want you to draw your attention to here is that the larger the universe gets, the lengths of the terminal lives and the transient lengths of the immortal lives get longer and longer, and the structure of those lives gets richer and richer. So although I've only worked this out to 7x7, you can see that things can become quite intricate, even for small universes, when gliders come into existence in those universes, in terms of the structure of the interactions that it can engage in that universe. There's one other fun thing we can do just because in the 5x5 universe, just because it's so small, we can actually visualize the entire set of all possible histories of a 5x5 Conway physics universe. Okay, it looks like this. It has about 33.5 million vertices, which are broken into a little over 5,000 components, which can be grouped into 55 different 55 different structures, let me just say, with multiplicities. So there are, 25 different symmetry equivalent versions of this structure. Okay. So this is not glider lives now. This is universe histories, all possible histories of a 5x5 Conway physics universe. Okay. The glider lives are a subset of these histories, and where the 5x5 glider lives fall in this picture is right there. Okay. There are 20 immortal glider lives that can occur in a 5x5 Conway physics universe. Okay. All the rest of these universe histories never give rise to a glider. Okay. I believe there's a hand up. So do you want to ask a question?
So this is on toroidal 5x5 universe. The cells wrap around the edges.
Yes, I said it's toroidal or periodic. Yeah.
Okay.
Otherwise, none of the things I've been showing you for the past number of slides would be finite. Okay. So the thing that's interesting about this picture, and I'm going to come back to this at the very end, is that this illustrates that there are two completely different levels of description that are relevant, at least two, let's say, that are relevant to this toy model. Up to this point, I've been focusing on a glider as an emergent individual, as a unitary entity confronting its environment. But every one of those descriptions can also, any one of those situations could be also redescribed as just the inexorable unfolding of the Conway physics. Okay, and everything that we've been focusing on, namely the glider lives, just serve as some typically very, very tiny subset of all the possible histories of the Conway physics. Okay, so let me wrap up this piece of the talk. To summarize what we've done with structural coupling, we've taken the glider interaction graph and the environment interaction graph. The glider interaction graph, remember, was derived from subjecting the glider to all possible perturbations, and the glider itself was derived from this autopoietic definition of its organization, of its closed organization. We've taken those two interaction graphs, we've plugged them together so that they're mutually perturbing, and that's what structural coupling is all about. And then we've worked out all the possible glider lives that can arise in that setup. We don't have any freedom to change the glider interaction graph, because if we did, it wouldn't be a glider. That glider interaction graph ultimately derives from the glider organization, but we could look at, for example, if anyone's familiar with the game of life, we could look at other persistent entities like a blinker interaction graph, right? Or a glider gun interaction graph, or any sort of persistent bounded structure that that can exist. We could define the glider interaction graph. The environment interaction graph formulation is general, but it depends on what entity you're talking about, because environments aren't objective properties of the physical universe. They're always defined relative to some emergent individual. So you have to pick an emergent individual, then you can extract its environment, and then you can look at the structural coupling that can occur between the two, and the lives, if you will, that that entity can live given that class of environments. Okay. Again, I will pause. Now we've got a pretty good story of interaction with this glider to add to our story of constitution that I told you earlier in terms of autopoietic ideas. So questions about these two stories before I take one more step? Okay, I never know what no questions means. It either means everything is completely clear or I've completely lost everyone and they're just waiting for it to be over. But I will, since you invited me, I will blindly plow ahead here to the very last piece of the talk, which is, what is the relation between the constitutive account I've given you and the interactive account I've given you? This is actually a thing in enaction. It's often referred to as life-mind continuity, the question of how existence relates to well, let's see how, one way of saying it is how biology relates to cognition. Another way of saying it is how constitution relates to interaction. Another way of saying it is how individuality relates to participatory concepts. Okay. So this is a thing in enaction. It's a debate. That debate is carried on verbally. And the thing I want to point out is that now that we have essentially a theory, although I haven't stressed the more mathematical formulation of this, I've tried to focus on just the ideas, but we have a tentative theory of glider constitution. And we have a tentative theory of glider interaction. And so we can ask this question about how constitution and interaction, or how life and cognition, or whatever words you want to use, what the relationship between those two things is. We can ask in a much more concrete way as to what the relation between this constitutive theory and this interactive theory actually is. Okay, so we want to know how these two concepts relate. Do they relate? That's some of the debate. Some people adopt the position that these are non-intersecting domains of description. Okay. Other people would argue that they're coextensive. And what I want to do is investigate the relationship between these two theories in this toy model context. Okay. All right. So to do that, I have to do something which I needed to do anyway, but this forced me to do it, which is this, the thing on this side is still the vacuum glider organization. It's a description of the glider constitution in an empty universe. But what's over here is about gliders interacting with the universe. And so there's something incommensurable right now between these two sides. And the only way I'm going to be able to bridge that gap is if I can replace the vacuum glider organization with some kind of more generalized description of the organization that holds not just in empty universes, but also in, rich, dense, filled universes. Okay. So to do that, let me point out a limitation of the vacuum glider organization that follows from the fact that it's a vacuum glider organization. So here is the picture I showed you before about the vacuum glider organization and the basic structure that I use to extract that organization. So let's do something to this picture. Let's just change one cell outside of the glider from a 0 to a 1. Okay, so I'm taking an empty universe and I'm putting one additional cell in that universe, one additional thing. That one cell affects this process, which previously looked a certain way, and now, because there's another on cell within its scope, becomes a different process. Okay. So it's no longer this process, it's now this process. And because this closed organization was made up of processes, one of which was this process, this is no longer accurate anymore. Okay. So the vacuum glider organization cannot tolerate even a single additional on cell in the entire universe. However, if we actually put that cell on and look at what happens, how does it play out? It turns out that the glider undergoes exactly the same sequence of states as it did before. Okay, so there's some sense in which that on cell has to make no difference. It has to be somehow allowed by the organization of a glider, but we haven't captured that fact in this representation of the organization. Another problem that you'll notice, when this comes back around, it's now not this process, it's this process. So even if we somehow allowed this process to replace this one, that would only work the first time around. When you come back, you would have a different process here, and you wouldn't have closure of the overall network of processes. So it's not just that the vacuum glider organization can't be applied to cases where the universe is non-empty. It's that there's something fundamentally missing about what constitutes a glider in the vacuum glider organization, because this is still a glider by any definition that you could want. So we need a way to describe organizations that capture, that generalize over this kind of thing. Okay? That is, we need to replace this description of the glider organization, which is too specific to one particular situation. We need to replace it with a more generalized description that applies to basically all of the situations in which a glider can persist. Okay. And to do that, we basically have to generalize our notion of a process. So now I need to get into a little bit more detail about how I've represented processes. So there are basically 4 classes of processes: 0 maintenance, production, 1 maintenance, and destruction. And these are just what was in that table that I skipped over at the beginning. And the way to read these pictures is that the central color tells us what kind of process it is. And the 2 different gray pictures around it basically give us what surrounding cells need to be on or off so that this particular process is triggered. So for this production process, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 surrounding cells need to be off, and these 3 surrounding cells need to be on, and that's what will trigger this specific one production process. Okay. Likewise for the other types of processes. So in order to see how I'm going to generalize this to what I call partial processes, let's use this example, and let me draw your attention to the fact that this L-shaped region is the same for all 4 of these processes. Okay. And there are other processes so there are other 0 maintenance processes, production processes, and so on, that have the same L-shaped state, but they differ in the state of this other L-shaped region. Okay. And the idea of a partial process is to be able to capture sets of processes that share some enabling conditions, but not others. Okay. So this is the notation that I use for a partial process. This part, the part that's fixed, is the same as for a regular process. Dark gray for on cells, light gray for off cells. The yellow cells correspond to cells that are unspecified. Okay. So I haven't told you what the state of these cells are. So for example, it could represent this production process, or it could represent this production process. Okay. And which of those it represents depends on, because of the way the Conway physics works, it depends on the sum of the contents of all the yellow cells. So if the sum of those contents is 1, then this is going to be a production process of some sort. I need to know not just the sum, but the exact configuration to know which production process it is. Okay. But if the sum of those values is not 1, then according to the Conway physics, this is going to be a 0 maintenance process. That is, this cell will stay off in the future. And likewise, we can do the same thing for this set of processes. We can define a partial process that essentially captures all the elements of this set in one picture. Okay. Armed with this notion of partial processes, we can construct a representation of the glider organization that applies to all the situations in which a glider can exist. And this is it. Okay. So it's made up of some total processes, that is, processes that have no yellow unspecified cells in them, but also quite a few partial processes. And these partial processes basically correspond to the values of the one environment surrounding this glider, that as long as the appropriate sum constraints are met, and I'm not representing them here because that gets too busy, but each of these partial processes has a sum constraint, right? It has something like this attached to it, okay? Depending upon the sum constraints of all these different partial processes, that is, depending upon the structure of the one environment, these things can be, in these cases, they can be production or zero maintenance processes. But this thing applies to all non-destructive one environments, not just the empty one environments, okay? So this is my generalization of the closed glider organization, that is the closed network of process interdependencies that constitute exactly a glider. Okay, if you have an organization like this, you've got a glider. And if you've got a glider, it must have this underlying organization in the Conway physics. So there's nothing left out now. Now we can go back to our question about the relationship between the constitutive and the interactive accounts of a glider, and by replacing the vacuum glider organization with this generalized glider organization. Okay, and it turns out that you can derive a relationship between these two entities, and it just briefly we do the following steps. First, we do a spatial embedding. These process dependency networks are topological entities. They only say what processes depend on what other processes. There's no spatial embedding associated with them. But because each of these processes themselves carry a little atom of space, and because these processes are interdependent in a structured way, it turns out you can algorithmically derive a spatial embedding of this process dependency network. And this is what it looks like. There are basically 16 locally spatially embedded configurations implicit in the atoms of geometry and the dependencies of this network. Okay, then we can take that spatially embedded process dependency network and we can color all the bundles of dependencies between any pair of these different embeddings the same color. And we can do it in a way that respects the symmetry. So for example, this bundle and this bundle should be the same because this set of processes is the left-right reflection of this set of processes. Okay, when we do that, and I pick colors in a suggestive way, but that's arbitrary, you end up with this colored spatially embedded process dependency network. Okay, the next step is to take a look at each of these sets of processes. And remember, every set of processes is triggered by a particular configuration of components. So we can invert that and take a set of processes and say what configuration of components had to be there in order to trigger that set of processes. So we replace process sets with configurations of components. I'm sure everybody can see where I'm going with this. The last step is to take all of the bundle of light-colored dependency arcs between any two set of configurations and just represent them with a single bundle, and we get this picture. This picture and this picture are the same. So what I've shown is that how did I get this picture originally? I exhaustively applied every possible one environment perturbation to a glider and looked at what happened. Okay, but I've just shown that I didn't have to do that. If I just started from the constitutive description of a glider, I just started from its organization, I can systematically derive the glider interaction graph from that organization. It's not an independent entity. Okay. Basically, consistent bundles of process dependencies in the generalized glider organization correspond to classes of environmentally triggered transitions in the glider interaction graph. Okay. So just to summarize this part, and then I'm going to conclude and wrap up. I've gone a bit over, but I also answered some questions, so hopefully I'm still within bounds here. So I started with a theory of the vacuum glider organization as a theory of glider constitution. And then sort of independently and in parallel, I worked out the glider interaction graph through exhaustive perturbation studies. Then I worked out the environment interaction graphs and show how you could put those two together with structural coupling to derive a full account of all possible lives of a glider in a given universe. And the totality of this thing constituted a theory of interaction in a glider. Then in this last piece, I've shown how to generalize the vacuum glider organization to a generalized glider organization. And I've shown you that given a generalized glider organization, you can derive the glider interaction graph. So these two things, constitution and interaction, or, if you want to call it this, life and mind, biology and cognition, in this toy model are not independent things. But an important component of this is derivable from this. I want to stress, though, that this does not reduce interaction to constitution, because the full account of constitution also requires the environment interaction graph. Okay, and that does not follow solely from the generalized glider organization. This also depends on the rest of the environment. So this is a connection. It's not a total reduction, and there's still a distinct constitutive theory and interactive theory. It's just that parts of the one are derivable from the other. So this gives a much richer sense of the relationship between constitution and interaction, and I think potentially a much richer playing field, if you will, for debates about life-mind continuity in enaction. This also turned out to have some really interesting implications for the concept of viability and a viability constraint. I recently watched Nathaniel Virgo's talk in your series, and he talked about, I think, the good set. So that's an example of a viability constraint. It turns out that these connections between constitution and interaction have really interesting implications for how we need to think about viability constraints, especially in emergent individuals, which is a topic that we have a forthcoming paper I'm going to be presenting a week from now at A-Life, but again, something I'm not going to get into today. So let me conclude and then open it to general questions. I want to draw, before giving you a summary and stopping, I want to draw one final speculative lesson from this toy model. Okay. So another really important component in the biology of cognition work of Maturana and Varela, and it's implicit but also important in enaction, is the idea of an observer. Okay, observers are the entities that make distinctions between different entities in a universe. Okay, so us looking out at this, the world pictorially represented here, we identify cities and cars and bicycles and dogs and birds and trees and so on. These are things that we carve out of the universe. Okay. The problem is, and this is something that Maturana actually began his whole career in this biology of cognition by observing. The problem is that specifically the scientific observer is the one that draws these distinctions, that pulls out these objects that we investigate. But the scientific observer, being a member of an observer community, is also part of that universe that we'd like to understand. It's the part that does the cognition, that does the distinctions and so on, okay? So this leads to yet another circularity. There are so many circularities kind of lurking in this area of work. This circularity is exacerbated by the fact that we as scientific, or just let's say general observers, we as observers that carve the world up into things that we want to explain are also embedded within that very world, okay? And it leads to a lot of very difficult issues, which have by no means been resolved anywhere, let alone in biology of cognition or enaction. And I'm not going to resolve them right now. I just want to make an observation. I want to make an observation that this toy universe that we've been talking about, the situation's a little bit different, okay? We as scientific observers are not embedded in the Conway universe. We stand outside it and can objectively look into it and report objective facts about that universe. Okay. Might we be able to also look at or think about what would constitute an observer in the Conway universe, but still from our objective perspective outside the Conway universe? That is, might there be a way to develop an account of at least a very primitive sort of subjectivity that cuts this circular loop of doing it in the universe in which we are embedded by trying to do it in a universe that we are outside of, but still trying to account for how an observer might arise and what properties such an observer might have. Okay, what do I mean? Well, we or John Conway created this universe, this physical universe, the Conway universe. It's not our physical universe, but it is a physical universe. Again, it has primitive components and a universal law that governs everything about that. Us peering into that universe as external observers have identified certain unities, certain entities of interest, and talked about their constitution and their environments and their interaction and how they engage with things and so on. That's from the perspective of an external observer. Now, it's possible a different external observer that, for example, had very different visual systems than ours might carve the Conway physics into a very different sorts of patterns than the ones that we pick out very naturally. Okay, but at least all of us pick out the same sorts of patterns as persisting and being bounded and being of interest and so on. Okay. But in our analysis of the glider, not only have we identified an emergent individual of interest, but we've also started to work out what the Conway universe looks like to a glider. From our outside perspective, we may see, all these different patterns, but I've shown you that a glider can only distinguish 6 things. Okay. 2 different members of the blue perturbation class are indistinguishable from a glider's point of view, because it isn't equipped via its constitution to make that distinction. Likewise, we may look at a blue one environment and an orange one environment, and although they are indeed physically different, we may not see any reason to group them into these blue and orange categories. But gliders do, and they do by their very constitution. By the way in which they are organized as emergent individuals, they carve the game of life universe up in a way that's different from the way we do it, that's unique to gliders, because it's also different from a blinker or a block or anything else. Okay, so we've tracked this to the point where we can start talking about the emergence of a perspective within the universe. And we can talk about that from outside the universe, from our external observer perspective. And this might be, I'm just suggesting, again, this is a speculative suggestion to end on, this might be a vehicle for starting to try to sort out the very subtle, knotty issues between subjective and objective perspectives that constantly rear their head in biology and in cognition and so on. All right, let me summarize, final slide. So what I've tried to do is walk you through this whole arc of the enactive approach, from starting with an autonomous, in my case specifically, an autopoietic organization of processes, show you how that gives rise to an identity, show you how that identity and the hole it leaves behind in the universe when we identify it gives rise to a domain of interactions whose structure we've worked out. And finally, in this very last little bit, I've shown you how the nature of that domain of interactions actually carves out distinctions from a universe that weren't there before there was a glider, right? the universe intrinsically, the Conway physics doesn't intrinsically fall into red and orange and blue classes. It's only by virtue of a glider's existence and the way in which that glider can interact with that universe that those classes arise. So certain structures become significant in this universe of the physical universe of sort of non-significance. Certain substructures become significant by virtue of going around this loop. And the final thing I want to leave you with is, although this is a rather rich and subtle sequence of ideas, which, as I've mentioned, previously largely been only debated and analyzed verbally, I think I've shown you how, with the right toy model, we can really start to probe what some of these things might mean. It's not that this Conway physics toy model replaces the physical universe. It's clear that there's a tremendous number of things that are left out of this toy model, but it lets us try to concretize things that are really important to these fields, but that have only been able to be discussed verbally in the past. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and we'll stop.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Dept. You can hear us applauding. Wow, what a fascinating and insightful talk. Anyone who knows me will know that I'm kind of obsessed with the game of life, so this was very exciting for me. I would love to start with an Angie question, if I could be rude. So the game of life has all kind of possible end states from its starting state, right? So it can be
I'm sorry, there's a fan sound or something I'm getting. If you just maybe get a little closer. It has what kind of possible end states?
Sorry, yes. So the game of life has 4 end states, right? It can be blank, it can be repetitive, it can be noisy, or it can be complex, right?
According to some people, I mean, there's an awful lot of structure hidden in that classification, right? There are a lot of different periodic structures. There are many, many, many more non-periodic structures, and those matter. I mean, that's kind of like saying, like, there are, 2 possible states to this universe, or 3 possible states, let's say. It's either, it doesn't exist, or it's empty before the Big Bang. There's no universe. It's in thermal equilibrium, or it's complicated. I mean, that's true, but it's not a very interesting observation about a universe to make. I'm sorry, but go ahead.
That's okay. Yes, good point. I wondered if the possible states of glider and environment interactions also kind of fit this pattern.
I mean, this is where it gets tricky. And I mentioned that some people define it that way. It gets down to how you define those different classes. So given some definition of complexity, say, and as you probably know, there are dozens of them, okay, you could apply that definition to, say, a huge sample of glider universes and get a number out that gives you something about the fraction of them that are complex, the fraction of them that are noisy. Even periodicity is a really, really hard thing to compute, because the number, I've actually done this as part of my investigation of glider or of environment interaction graphs, but the number of distinct periodic attractors that exist in even small periodic universes, like 10 by 10 or 11 by 11, is astronomical. And the number of different ways you can embed them, and the lengths of the periods also explode exponentially. So even being able to computationally compute, even be able to compute that distinction for any but the smallest possible universe is probably not going to be possible, practical. But again, if you have something that you can compute, it can certainly be applied to this universe. I mean, the whole statistical mechanics thing that I derived for the origin of gliders thing gets into some of those issues, right? You're trying to look at statistical abstractions of different configurations of the environment and still try to pull some structure out about some question of interest. In that case, it was, what are the conditions under which gliders arise? I don't know if I'm calling on people or what, but Mike.
Yeah, I can call on people. Mike, you can go ahead. Then we have a question from Mateusz. Then
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you for that really interesting, thought-provoking talk, and also thank you for the many years of really great, rigorous work you've done in this topic. My question is probably maybe a bit speculative, but maybe it's something you've thought about before. I want to ask you about the term agency, which is not exactly a word that you use, but it's sort of closely related. And at least colloquially, agency is something that we generally associate with like complex biology, right? So most people would not say that plants have agency. But lots of animals with nervous systems do have agency. And one of the big concerns about AI and AI safety, or lack of AI safety, is exactly this, agency. That these complex models, even though they're not biological, they can exhibit agency and make decisions and engage behaviors that were not specifically programmed into them, and that could be, potentially dangerous or at least undesirable. So I guess my question is, do you think that, and so like these large language models, these deep learning models, they exist in our universe, but they don't really follow the same laws of physics, right? That, in the sense that they don't have like biology the way that we do.
I mean, they do follow the same law of physics, but
right, yeah, but they don't have the same set of
yes.
constraints that that neurons have.
Yes.
So I guess my question is, do you think that Conway physics could create an agentic individual in the way that we colloquially think of agency? Or do you think that there is some like minimal level of complexity of the foundational physics that is necessary to create agency in the way that we think of it?
Yeah, sure. So I think I may have slipped up, but I'm pretty sure I don't use the word agent in this presentation.
Yeah. No, you didn't.
And no, but it's a fair question. I'm just pointing that out. That's purposeful. Because there are a lot of different accounts about what an agent is. Just like there are a lot of accounts to Angie's question about what's complex. Okay, so the way this whole strategy of research, this whole research program works, is that you would take some definition of agency and bring it to the Conway universe. If it's just a verbal definition, then it's really going to be really hard. Then you just argue about the Conway universe rather than our universe. But if it's a mathematical definition, then you can actually apply it to this universe and see how it comes out. I mean, that's the way in which I'm trying to sell the overall research program. Even if you don't like the particular moves I've made, I think the most important thing is that you can take these conceptual, slippery verbal questions and really concretize them when you apply them to something like this. So that's my first waffly response, is that you need to come to such a discussion with a definition of agency, ideally a formal one, in order to really work that out. Secondly, I guess I would say, as you probably know, but I didn't explicitly mention, the Conway physics is computationally universal. So it is complicated as any Turing machine in principle. So unless you think agency is not computable, then the answer has got to be yes, that agents could arise in the Conway physics. At what level of space and time and number of states complexity, that depends again on what your notion is. Okay. I think autonomy is a slightly better notion than agency because it's a less loaded term, although it's by no means universally agreed upon. And I also think thinking about agency as a binary property is wrong. Personally, I would grant agency to any biological system. But there are degrees in our world now, I'm talking in our physical universe, but there are certainly degrees of agency. And I think it ultimately has to do with, in some sense, the richness of internal state of the individual as compared to the richness with which it's driven by its environment. And that's a continuous trade-off. You can have individuals that are completely driven by their environments. Mathematically, those are just functions, right? So what they do is just a function of what the environment does to them. But the moment you start having internal dynamics of any sort, that's no longer true. And so regardless of what the environment does to them, there's a little bit of freedom that they have to do something based on their own internal situation. The more such states you give a system, the more it can diverge from just letting the environment push it around, is kind of the way I look at it.
Right, thanks. Yeah, I would love to continue that discussion and politely disagree, but I won't take up more time. But thanks for that answer.
Sure.
All right. Let me ask one of the two questions Mateusz has, then we'll go back to people with the hands up. Mateusz asks, what would be the simplest application of this framework to some biological system or even some non-biological system that has some relevant lifelike properties?
That's a really interesting question. I sorry to keep doing this, but it really comes down to what you mean by interesting, what you mean by biological, what you mean by lifelike. So there is, for example, a continuous time, continuous state, a cellular automaton called Linea, or Linea, depending on how you pronounce it, that some of you may have heard of before, that's gotten an awful lot of press by Bart Chan at Google, I think, that exhibits these sorts of persistent bounded entities that arise, and persist and interact with one another and with their environments and so on. A lot of people call that lifelike. Okay. If that's good enough, then I mentioned to you one of my students, Tom Gall, has been working on taking steps to generalize this framework, which is built on discrete time, discrete space, into discrete time continuous space, which is not linear, but there are some other cellular automata, like something called larger than life, and its continuous generalization called real life, in which you can also get these kinds of structures. So that would be one possibility. The other thing that we've done is with a former student, Duran Agman, we tried to apply some of these ideas to a protocell model. So this was a model that actually tried to account for some of, it's still abstract though, it's not an actual biological cell, but it tried to account for things like lipid dynamics in membrane formation and cellular metabolism, including energy requirements and so on. So this was basically a PDE model, which computationally was amounted to about 8,000 highly nonlinear differential equations. Okay, and we did some of this analysis for that system. So for example, we don't have a constitutive account of it. That's actually the thing that we're focusing on with this continuous state or continuous space discrete time model that Tom is working with. But what we did look at was basically working out at least portions of its interaction graph. And I have a couple of papers on that. So subjecting it to different classes of perturbations and looking which were destructive and which were non-destructive, and for the non-destructive ones, what was the structure of the responses that protocell model generated and so on. So those are some initial steps. I think it's hard. And there are subtleties even in this toy model. I don't think this toy model is a solved problem. There are still interesting subtleties there, which I've been interested in working on. I mean, I get this kind of question constantly. My entire career has been built around essentially really working out toy models in great detail, whereas most people, if they even bother to look at that simple of a toy model, would find one result and then complicate it. My feeling is that the only time that you should leave a toy model is when it's stopped providing any insights, that you've exhausted the insights it has to provide, because otherwise you're stepping into a more complicated model that you don't understand before even understanding the toy model, right? So that's a strategic thing that I do in my research, but I've mentioned at least a few directions where other people are looking at. Another thing that nobody talked about yet, but I often get asked about is, of course, the Conway universe is completely deterministic. What about a stochastic setting? So there are some people like Miguel Aguilera who's been interested in trying to put a more realistic thermodynamics into an otherwise Conway physics-like universe and be able to, for example, require energy or high quality energy or matter influx in order to produce and sustain far from equilibrium organizations like these closed organizations. That would be another direction you could complexify. Even within the game of life, you could look at emergent individuals that are larger and have more internal states and structure to them than a glider does. Okay, so there's just lots of ways in which you could complicate, and it really depends on what question you're most interested in getting answered, and I guess your tolerance for leaping into rat's nests before you know enough about the simpler situations that I'm starting from.
Thank you for the answer. Joppe, I'm sorry for butchering the name.
Oh, that's all right. Thank you for a great talk. It answered a lot of questions about Game of Life that I didn't even know I found interesting before coming to this talk. So that was really great.
Could I just say one thing quickly? This is also a common misunderstanding. I'm not sure you're making it, but I want to be very clear. This entire talk is not about the Game of Life, right?
But as a toy model for something more
It's a toy model that has certain features that I use to explore biology, cognition, and enaction. So it could be replaced completely, and this would still be an interesting research program. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I promise that is what I meant. So for my question, I'm interested in this embedded observer angle, and I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit about the experience of passage of time. How do you think the experience of passage of time of one of these embedded observers relates to like the
I'm going to do it again.
dynamics?
I'm going to do it again. What do you mean by experience? You have to come forward with some notion of experience. I have not given you one. What would amount to an experience in the Conway physics? If experiences are computable, and some people would argue they're not, but if they are, then they have to occur within the Conway physics somewhere. Whether or not they occur with the glider is a totally separate question, but they'd have to occur if they're a computable thing, okay? But that's not saying very much. You have to have some notion of what an experience would amount to before I could even begin to answer that question. And so I can't even speculate without agreeing on some notion of experience. I mean, how do I know you have experiences? We have conversations in which I become convinced that you have experiences of some sort. We can't converse with gliders we'd have to have a medium of communication to even engage in that kind of interaction with them.
Yeah, I guess I was getting at the passage of time for the glider or for the observer. Maybe experience was a superfluous term here, or maybe it was a crucial term. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, but I mean, in one sense, the passage of time is trivial. It's the physical time, right? But I think you do need the notion of experience to get at what you were interested in, which is what does the passage of time seem like to an emergent individual in the Conway universe? And again, it comes back to what do you mean by experience? What do you mean by seems like? I don't mean to be evasive, but if this has taught me anything, it's that you can toss around words like structural coupling and autopoiesis and observer and perturbation and so on, sense making, significance, value, all these things that come in action. But what I need to do science is to be able to flesh them out and pin them down. And because we mostly don't know how to do that for the full confusion of us, I'm looking at these toy models and saying, well, here's one thing it could mean. You may not agree with me, but then let's debate something very specific and concrete here. Like I mentioned, something very simple like that. When are two gliders the same glider when they're separated by one time step of the physical universe? Okay, that's something I never thought about until I had to define these perturbations and what it meant for a glider to survive. So you end up having to nail down lots and lots of things, and each one of those becomes a choice point that one could could follow me completely up to that choice point, but then make a different choice and explore the consequences of that. And that's a power, I think, of this approach.
Yeah, thank you for your answer, and thank you for a great talk.
It really wasn't an answer, but I didn't give you, sorry.
Thank you for speculating with me.
All right. And for the last question, we had Mateusz ask another question. How do the two ways of deriving the glider interaction graph compare in terms of computational complexity efficiency? For example, in terms of number of calculations or such?
Well, I mean, the first way was just exhaustive enumeration, right? I mean, it's actually pretty fast for one environment because there's only, 20-some million possibilities. For a larger kind of structure, or if you start incorporating two environments, which I didn't get into any of this, but there are situations where you have to pay attention to that as well, that just explodes combinatorially, right? In principle, the derivation that I gave you, each of the steps is not, I have to be careful because there are, I mean, like the algorithm that we apply to derive the spatial embedding of a process dependency graph is going to also have its own scaling issues, right? You can't do that in your head or on a piece of paper. It's all straightforward in that it's just processing these dependency links and basically combing out the implications of them, but that's going to grow too. And so I guess it comes down to essentially a computational complexity analysis of the two routes. And the one is going to grow with just the number of perturbations. The other one, I guess the hope would be that once you really understand the way the interaction graphs are embedded in the process dependency networks, you could work class by class rather than individual perturbation by individual perturbation. And the number of classes is going to grow much more slowly than the total number of perturbations. But that's an assertion. I've not worked it out in any other case, and I've never done the computational complexity analysis to be able to say for sure. My intuition is just that a derivation based on some knowledge of the relationship has got to, in the end, beat blind, exhaustive enumeration. Certainly from a scientific point of view, it's more insightful that you're actually doing something with some theoretical grounding, even if it's more computationally expensive, than just, throwing I don't know, a particle accelerator or whatever, where you just smash gliders and environments together for decades and look at all the things that happen and just kind of keep your tally sheet as to what one of those, another one of those, and so on. I mean, I would think in the end it's better to do it the theory way, but
yeah. Mateusz, any follow-up? No? There we go. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Beer, for being here with us, for being our guest. Thank you for the audience for the insightful discussions and questions, and to the people watching later, thanks for watching. Hope to see you again, and good luck at the A-Life conference next week.
great. Thank you for having me.